Hi, I'm glad you're here. This week, I want to talk about job enrichment and job characteristics theory as a primary prevention strategy for reducing job-related stress. Work Redesign, that's the name of a book, classic book now that was written in 1980 by an Oldham, but it focuses on the characteristics of the job itself and the motivation potential of a job. And when you look at the nature of jobs, stress with some jobs can be related to the conditions of the job itself. For example, if a person is tied to an assembly line they can't get off except when they're relieved, that can be stressful. And a score can be calculated for the motivation potential of a specific job. This is the actual theory. If you look at the job characteristics, and I'll show you here in a minute the formula and how they're related. But you have skill variety, task identity, and task significance. So skill variety is how much of a person's potential is demanded by the job. This would be both mental and physical potential. Task identity is how easily a person can relate to the outcome of the job. For example, I remember when I was very young and I had first hired into a factory and I was on an assembly line running a screwdriver, and all I knew was that we made lights. And later I learned that we were making taillights for Cadillacs. And that made a difference in how I felt about my work. And so it was task identity. Once I learned that, it made a difference in the meaningfulness of the work. Task significance is the perception of the importance of the work. All three of those characteristics are related to meaningfulness of the work. And there's autonomy, how much freedom a person has to make decisions about how they're doing their work, and that's experienced as responsibility. And then feedback, knowledge of the work results. And feedback is really an important element. Most people are not motivated to do anything if they don't receive feedback about what they're doing. Okay, if we look at the outcomes here for the whole model, high internal work motivation comes out of the meaningfulness categories, high gross satisfaction, high job satisfaction can be related to all of these characteristics, and as well as work effectiveness. Now, we can quantify this and put it into a formula. And if we use a Likert scale of 1 to 7 for each variable in the formula, and the first three, if let me back up for a second here, skill variety, task identity, and task significance, divided by 3, times autonomy, times feedback. That's the actual formula. So this would mean, using that Likert scale, 7 times 7 times 7, so a maximum score is 343. That would be very high motivating potential. In the normative data, the national average was 128. And there are many jobs that exist well below that national average score. So now what I'd like for you to do, I'd like for you to use this formula. I have the formula listed here. And I want you right now to think of a job that you've performed at some time in your life that was boring or not motivating or perhaps even highly stressful. And I want you to think of each of these characteristics. So for example, as you think of this job, how demanding was this job of your skills on a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being very low and 7 being very high? And then I'd like for you, on a piece of scrap paper, write that number down. Then task identity, how well were you able to identify to the end result of what you're contributing to? For example, were you like me on a assembly line, not knowing what you were making, or was it easy to identify to the end result? Once again, low identity 1, high identity 7, write that number down. And then task significance, how important did you feel this job was? 1 being very low and 7 being very high. So now you would write that number down. And then I'd like for you to add those 3 numbers together and divide them by 3 so that you have 1 number. Then how much autonomy, how much freedom did you have on the job to decide when to go to the restroom, when to take breaks, how to go about doing your job? 1 low, 7 is high, write that number down. And then how did you know if you were doing a good job? 1 very low, meaning you didn't know if you were doing a good job or not. 7 very high, you immediately would know. Write that number down. Now multiply your 3 numbers together and come up with a number for your motivation potential score for this job. And then I want you to remember that number, because we're going to do this again with a more motivating job and make a comparison. My guess is for the majority of people, the number you just calculated is below 128. It's below the national average. All right, so now let's do this again, only this time I want you to think of a job that's highly motivating. If you've never had a highly motivating job, think of your dream job that perhaps you're preparing for now as a result of being in school. And same thing, how much of your human potential does it demand on a scale from 1 to 7? How much task identity could you relate to the outcome? 1 to 7, write that down. And then how important was this work? 1 to 7. Add those 3 and divide it by 3 so you have 1 number. All right, then how much autonomy did you have in going about doing this job? Write that number down. And feedback, how did you know if you were doing a good job? On a scale from 1 to 7, write that down. Multiply this out, see what your number is. And I'm willing to bet that the number for this job is much higher than the number of the job you calculated in part 1. So now compare your scores. Would your performance be more motivated and sustained on the higher scoring job? I would argue yes. And how do your scores compare to the national average and to the maximum score? I know a lot of people, when they calculate their dream job, they're very near the maximum score. Now, how can you improve a job? Let's say we have a job that's highly stressed. Well, we look at these 5 characteristics of the job to see where the lowest scores appear. And sometimes we can combine tasks to form larger modules of work, which would increase skill variety. For example, in manufacturing, and teams often do job rotation, which is a good way to increase skill variety. Not only that, it increases task identity, because they're seeing every component or every aspect of a job. And then establish client relationships. Then there's task identity by focusing on the client, or task significance, seeing how the client is affected. In other words, increases the importance of the job. Open feedback channels. I remember one time I was working with a group on third shift, and it was in manufacturing, and they assembled leaf springs, and I had them all motivated, and they were fired up. They were the most productive of all 3 shifts, and this went on for a couple of weeks. And the problem was there was a machine that was used to measure the torque of the leaf springs, and it had to be at a certain level or the leaf springs weren't any good. And we didn't have enough equipment for third shift to have their own machines to measure torque, so they would assemble leaf springs, and then they'd be torqued on first shift the next day. So I remember one time they worked hard all night long, set a production record, and they came in the next day and found out everything they ran the night before had been rejected because the torque wasn't good enough. And so from that point on, they suddenly realized that while they were working, they didn't know if what they were building would be accepted or not. So the absence of feedback just destroyed the motivation on that job. Making work self-paced rather than paced by a line can increase autonomy. Expanding boundaries where people where you spend more time defining the outcome and giving people more autonomy over the how-to. Work redesign can provide a theory for a primary prevention strategy that can help in reducing stress in some circumstances. I've also seen jobs considered to be high-stress jobs simply because there's an absence of feedback. So sometimes providing that meaningful feedback can reduce the stress. If a job seems stressful in itself, changing the motivational potential of a job might be able to help reduce the stress, and this gives you at least one primary prevention strategy to think about. This content was based upon the book Work Redesign by Hackman and Odom, which I say is a classic. I highly recommend it. It's in paperback, and I'm sure it could be purchased inexpensively. Thank you.